Please welcome Dominiek Dendooven.
Guru Ka Khalsa. Dear friends, I'm very happy to be here. I have to thank the Kaur Foundation and this Guru Nanak Gurdwara for welcoming me. I was particularly moved because the last time I was in a Sikh Gurdwara during ceremony was nonetheless in Harmandir Sahib in 2017 in Amritsar, when I had the honor to give also a lecture the same day in Khalsa College in Amritsar. And I think that due to COVID and so on, I haven't been able to do a similar lecture for a Sikh congregation or Sikh community since. So I'm really happy because my venture into the presence of non-European troops who were present in Flanders during the First World War all started with the local Sikh community in Belgium way back in 1999, when I encountered, it was a chance encounter, I encountered in the museum the person Paul has already mentioned, Sardar Bhupinder Singh, Holland, and I started talking to him, and we discovered that Ieper, my hometown, the place I'm going to talk you about, is the place in Belgium where Sikh history and our history, or Belgian history, Flemish history, come together. And ever since, Sikhs have come together in Ypres to commemorate their martyrs who died in the First World War. And in 1999, and this was the first event I ever organized, I was very much younger then, was actually for the 300th anniversary of the birth of Khalsa in 4 April 1999, when the place which is now my museum was turned into a temporary Gurdwara. So being here is a very emotional moment for me. It only works when you switch it on. I will tell you something about battles, then I will tell you something about the experience Sikh and to a large extent South Asian soldiers had of the First World War in Flanders, and then I will tell you something about how we commemorate the Sikh presence with the Sikh community until this very day. Now we have to begin on the 4th of August 1914. 4th of August 1914 is the day that the German Empire invaded Belgium, and Belgium was a neutral country then, and the violation of Belgium was the reason why the British Empire declared war on Germany. And as the British Empire declared war on Germany, that meant that also India was at war, and that the Indian army would be mobilized, well, it was a standing army, would be dispatched not to Europe, but initially to Egypt to guard the Suez Canal. That was the initial idea, that as soon as war broke out, 2 divisions, the Lahore division, the Meerut division, would be sent to Egypt to guard the Suez Canal, which was vital for the connection between the UK and the Empire of India. But first of all, I should elaborate a little bit on what was happening in Europe and the place I'm coming from, for those who are less familiar. Belgium, which I need my glasses to have a far away look, so you can clearly see Belgium is in yellow on the map. I will have to tell you something about the nature of Belgium in 1914. It was a monarchy. It was a rich country with imperial ambitions. It had the Congo as a colony. It had only 7.5 million inhabitants. It was densely populated, but it was the 4th richest country in the world then. Military-wise, as I said, it was neutral. So it played no role in any of the 19th century wars ever since the defeat of Napoleon. And in Belgium, what happened after the German invasion is that this German invasion came to a standstill in the west of the country. And there it remained for 4 years. It did hardly move. It ran for, the front line there ran for about 50 kilometers from the coast to the French border. The deadlock there with the trenches began October 1914 with the first Battle of Ypres, and I'll tell you something more about that later on. And it ended in end of September 1918 when the war of movement resumed. So that means really 4 years of hardly any movement. It was a rural area, a bit less densely populated than the rest. That part of Flanders was less populated than the rest of the country, but there were mainly small towns, and it's very important to stress that it was an agricultural area, because that would mean that many of the Indians who served would feel more comfortable than they would have been in an industrial zone. The language spoken there is Flemish, which is a version of Dutch. But we're very near to the French border, and if I mean very near, that's only 10 miles from my hometown to the French border, so everybody would have spoken French. This is important, I stress it, because French was a language that many of the Indian soldiers, including the Sikhs, would pick up after some months. So here you see the front line as it was in Belgium, running from north to south to the French border, and Paul has already mentioned the Salient. Well, the Salient is, so here is the city of Ieper, and you see that the front line runs to the north, to the east, and to the south of the town, which makes it a very dangerous part, because if you're in Ypres, you can be shot at from 3 sides. You can be shot at from the north, from the east, and from the south. And in that area, that small area surrounding in the Salient, surrounding this town, and this very small area, which is only like from here to there is less than 10 miles. In that area, during 4 years, 500,000 people are killed. 500,000. I was yesterday on the battlefield of Gettysburg, which was only a 3-day battle, obviously, but that's just a very small fraction of the number that fall in my neighborhoods. The Indian troops, Indian army, but as you know, and as we were talking about the Lahore and the Meerut division, the Sikhs were, if they were not a majority, they were a very large part, they had a very large part, that would arrive in France in late September 1914. And as I already stressed, they were not meant to go to France, they were meant to go to Egypt. But when they were in Egypt, late August 1914, the British had already realized that their small professional army, which was much smaller than the Indian army, would be completely decimated. And so they needed the Indian army. They absolutely needed, they have forgotten now, but they absolutely needed the Indian army to be present on the Western Front. So they gave the orders that the 2 divisions, the 2 Indian army divisions, would be shipped over the Mediterranean to Marseille in southern France, where they arrived late 1914. Mind you, I will stress once again, they were meant to go to Egypt, meaning that they were in their summer uniform, so adapted to tropical climates. Mind you also that the Indian army always had weapons since the so-called Indian Mutiny, sometimes called First War of Independence, 1857. Since then, the Indian troops were given weapons that were 1 generation behind the weapons of the British army. So they went with antiquated weapons and in non-adapted uniforms to the Western Front. Yet when they arrived in Marseille, that's what you see on this photograph, they were hailed as heroes coming to help France, and then when they arrived in Belgium, also Belgium. It was really, even before they went into battle, it was a hero's triumph. This is a particularly nice photograph where you see a French lady pinning a flower on the chest of a Sikh officer. Now, propaganda plays a very, very important role. I want to stress, it's important to keep in mind that the Britons were actually reluctant to deploy Indians in Europe. And why were they reluctant? Because they were concerned about the image of the white man. And they were also reluctant, keeping in mind the mutiny of 1857, that these guys would gain fighting experience, because suppose that they would one day use the fighting experience against the British master. So they wanted to avoid that. So they were very reluctant, but once again, they needed the Indian troops, or they would lose the first battle of Ypres, which was going to begin. At one stage, just to show you how important the Indian presence was, at one stage in the beginning of the war, October 1914, 1/3 of the British line near Ypres was held by Indian troops. 1/3. Still, they managed to produce books which do not even mention the Indian presence during the first battle of Ypres. So we still have a lot of work to do to set that right. And keeping in mind what I just said, that the British were reluctant, but that they needed the Indians, as soon as they had rebuilt their army with volunteers and then later with conscripts, which was by the end of 1915, then they would send the Indians away from Europe to Mesopotamia, because they did not want non-European people seeing Europeans fight each other, all because of that idea of white supremacy. And the only ones who would stay on in Europe after late 1915 are cavalry behind the front line to accompany prisoners of war, and then later labor troops. So that's important to keep in mind. Infantry, the main group of Indian soldiers, were only there in the first year of the war. Despite the fact that they were not wanted, they were of great importance in propaganda, as you can see from the image to the left. And there's always this kind of exoticism, these big men with beards and turbans, so to the Europeans it spoke to them, so there's this, especially the Sikhs were photogenic and attractive to artists. But on the same hand, it's clearly propaganda, because if you look at the postcards to the left, it says comrades. Now I just want to remind you, the lowest British officer, or NCO, was always above the highest ranked Indian officer. So you could be, actually you had this situation where a British corporal could order an Indian subadar, despite this fact in rank, but that was how it functioned. So actually this kind of postcards is lie. The Indian troops would arrive in our area in Flanders from 22nd of October 1914. Here you see how they arrived. These are London double-decker buses, which were commandeered by the British Army, and they were used to bring the troops to the front line. And you can clearly see, we don't know exactly which troops, but they are clearly turbaned. So these is the arrival of the Indian troops. The first guy who died, first Indian who died, was a Naik, called Laturia. We do not know anything about his background, but he's one of the first, well, he is the first we know that died. And then the first Battle of Ypres was already raging, and almost immediately they were sent to the front line. And the first Indian battalion to be deployed was the 57th Wilds Rifles in the region of Weensgaten, a small village. And the 57th Wilds Rifles had several companies. You had a company of Sikhs, you had a company of Punjabi Muslims, and this is a company of Punjabi Muslims that were serving with the Sikhs, sitting in that village. And Yves Wantens from the Flemish government is sitting here. Maybe he can read, because this is say Nieuw-Staanezer, which was the name of the cafe, and they're sitting in front of that cafe. And it's an important moment, end of October 1914. This is the first time Indians are fighting in Europe, but in very difficult circumstances. Autumn weather, pouring rain, against overwhelming odds. There is not a continuous line of defense. The Indian troops, especially the Sikhs, were considered as reserve, so they were split up. And for instance, one British unit would say, oh, we need urgently 50 men. Well, 50 men would be sent to there, 50 men would be sent to another place. So it was not good for the cohesion and for the fighting strength of the troops. But again, I want to stress the Indians helped to save the day for the British Expeditionary Force. What if they were not there? Just very briefly, because I cannot go too much into detail, but these are two photographs of a map. To the left, 28th of October, to the right, the 1st of November 1914. If you sit close enough, you will see that the names of Indian regiments are mentioned here and there amongst them, but you see green is German, how much the Germans were pushing and getting closer to the city of Ieper, which is there, but not being able to get there. They would never get there. And then we shift, this was the first Battle of Ypres, we shift to 1915, because after the first Battle of Ypres, when the front line there was saved for the Allied, the Indians, including the Sikhs, were given their own sector in northern France, right until 22nd of April 1915. 22nd of April 1915 is a very important day in world history, because north of Ypres, the Germans tried to break the stalemate in the front by using for the first time a weapon of mass destruction, gas. Beginning of chemical warfare. And through the gas, this is what you see, this is what you see on this map. Through the gas, the Germans are getting much closer to Ypres. The Allies withdraw, but they are withdrawing, the Germans do not get closer. And it's a very strange, difficult situation. Now what do the British do? And the French as well, by the way. What do the British do? They send immediately a cable to Neuve-Chapelle, to the Indian sector, and they say, please rush in the Indian troops. We need them urgently at Ypres. So the Indian troops marched 24 hours on one end, with 1 hour pause, in the rain, over the cobbled streets, 35 miles until they arrive at Ypres, and without arrest, they are thrown on the 26th April of 1915, they are thrown into battle. And this is actually a map that shows, I'll show you more, that shows the attack of the Lahore division on the 26th of April 1915, including units like 47th Sikhs regiment, a complete Sikh regiment. They are rushed into battle. They have no idea where the new German position is. There is no artillery preparation. There are only German airplanes in the sky, no Allied airplanes in the sky. So it's a very disadvantageous situation. And moreover, I'll try to explain this. This is actually the battlefield where that happened. And this is what you see as, what you saw as an attacking Sikh soldier. You see it's a flat landscape, but still you have a whole horizon line. The horizon line here perhaps 200 yards, 200 meters. And then it goes a bit downhill. And you disappear out of view. And then it goes uphill again, and that's where the Germans are. So what was the view for the officers and for the rear? They saw the Indian troops disappearing over the ridge, and then nothing. And nobody came back. And what happened was the Germans had chosen very good positions. They had their machine guns, and when the attacking Indian troops came too close, they reopened the valves. So it's the first encounter of Indian troops with chemical warfare, and some attacking Indians have been killed by the chemical weapon at that stage. It was an enormous carnage, I just give you one example. Again, the 47 Sikhs. If you look at the 47 Sikhs, what happened in the beginning of the war, they were 750 men. By April 1915, so after 6 months of war, 444 of the 750 were still in the units. After 26th of April 1915, 347 out of the 444 had not come back, which is a loss of 80%. So 80% of the unit was lost. I will come back, when I talk about commemoration, I will come back to the 47 Sikhs. And still, despite the carnage on 26th of April 1915, the British commanders would reissue the attack and again and again. For during almost a week, every day, the attack was repeated. And it's the clearest example I know, and that was not always the case, it's the clearest example I know of Indian troops, colonial troops, being used as cannon fodder. And it's so clear because what you find in the archives, what you find in the archives is that after 4 days, you have the British commander-in-chief writing to the French commander-in-chief, and he said, well, no, the first attack has happened, we have established a new defensive line, so now let's bring in good troops. That's what he writes. Let's bring in good troops. So how do you have to understand that? Let's bring in white troops. Because that was the racialized thinking that they were having. And you see that the French did exactly the same, because the French troops deployed to the left of the Indians, they were not Africans, so also colonial troops. Really use of cannon fodder. At that time, their camp was just south of Ypres, and this is a very nice photograph where you see Sikh soldiers. They have taken a bath, they have washed their clothes, just next to Grotebeek Brook, it's the name of a brook. That was where their camp was, that's where their hospital was. I remember, the man has unfortunately died. I was talking to the man who lived in the farm nearby. He remembered the stories of his father, seeing the Indians living, being treated, and also being cremated, not far from this brook, if they were Hindu or Sikh. And this is the brook, how it looks today. If you go to the left, so that's to the right of the brook, this is the brook today. If you go to the left of the brook, you still have an Indian plot. These are the Muslims from the Indian troops that attacked there. Of course, they are buried, the others have been cremated. So you still got these traces present. It changed the nature of the First World War. The Indians would stay for another autumn and beginning of winter. That's a photograph from that period. I especially, on purpose, included the caption. For the caption reads, I say it in French first, Infanterie Anglaise, which means English infantry. But if you look well, you see that they're all wearing turbans. So they're not English infantry, they're Indian infantry. And they're wearing the very primitive gas mask from 1915, which clearly shows that they were fighting in these very dreadful circumstances. Now, I already told you that after the end of 1915, the infantry would move away, they would go to Mesopotamia, where again they would be involved in terrible battles. And after 1915, you mainly had cavalry, but you also had high-profile visits to the Western Front. This is one of these high-profile visits. This is a photograph we hold in our collection. Bhupinder Singh, Maharaj of Patiala, and the grandfather of Captain Amarinder Singh, former Chief Minister of Punjab, visiting the Belgian front. So he's with British officers and with Belgian officers. He met the Belgian king, and then he visited the Ieper front. So, and very recently, a book has been published based on what the press in India and particularly in Punjab published. There was a big interest, a high interest in what was going on in Belgium and in northern France at that stage in the local press. And local people would continue to encounter. The guys you see here are not soldiers, but they are laborers at the end of the war. They arrived from 1917 and would stay on until 1920. We do have witness accounts where local people in Belgium write, oh yeah, there were Indians staying there, and as a small boy, this is recorded many years after the war, after a small boy, we went to see them and they ate their pancakes, which is of course the chapatis. But in our slang, it was the pancakes. And remarkably, if you go to flea markets, sometimes you can encounter these mestins and thalis. And they're still, I know a collector, and he has a whole collection of mestins, some with the names inscribed of the soldier who owned it and of thalis and so on. Now about experiences. How did the Indian, especially the Sikh rank and file, experience Europe? Well, here you see a religious ceremony going on in the middle of a courtyard of a farm in Flanders. The Sikhs, just like the other Indian troops, were billeted with the local community, which means that they were living with the local community. And initially there was a lot of mutual mistrust. Mutual mistrust because who had ever seen an Indian in Belgium or northern France in 1913? And also for the Indians, it was the first time ever they were in Europe, so it was mightily strange. But still, they're living together, so what you see is you have curiosity, and then you even have mutual friendships developing. And I will give you proof, I will show you proof of these mutual friendships. And what is very important is that the Indian rank and file often found the locals much less racist than their British officers. And this was of course quite shocking. And you see them, they're writing home, and in their letters home they say, yeah, why are white people in India so brutal against us, while in France they are friendly? So this, and what it actually did is, it made them think about this whole colonial hierarchy that was imposed on them. So actually through engaging with the civilian population, they were looking at themselves, at their community, as Sikhs, as Punjabi Muslims, as Brahmins and or whatever castes, as Rajputs. They were looking at themselves, and they were looking at India with different eyes by being in Europe, by meeting local people. They see what is better in Europe, for instance education, but they also see what is worse in European civilization. And again, we will see examples of that. Meeting locals, this photograph, this is the next one in the series, where you see Sikhs giving presents to a local boy, also civilian people amongst the crowd there, or this photograph. The baby doesn't seem too happy, but still a very nice photograph. And I'll give you one quote because it's quite funny, by a local priest. Achille van Wallegem was a Catholic priest in the first inhabited village behind the front line in Flanders. And in May 1915, he writes the following sentences describing in his eyes, and of course there is some xenophobia involved, in his eyes, how he sees the Indians. And I write the following. He wrote the following: several Indian soldiers are also staying at my parish closest to Vlamerting, which is the name of another village. Their skin is dark, their army dress typically British, apart from a turban, which they have artfully wound around their heads. They speak English, some even French, because in the months that they are already in Europe, they have learned some French. They are very curious and ask and talk a lot. They would walk for half an hour to get some milk, stand around watching your every move as you serve them. They get their Indian money out, called rupee, and then between brackets, it gives the change, 280 to 1. And they get angry when people refuse to accept this currency. By and large, they are friendly and polite, yet their curiosity often gets the upper hand, and as they take you in from head to toe. They especially like to take a peek through the windows of our houses. They bake some type of pancakes and eat a type of seed with a very strong taste. So it's very funny. This is how someone who has never encountered Indians is seeing Indians. And then I just want to mention the diary writer, the priest, he accuses the Indians of being curious. And what does he write? Yeah, I've tasted the food. So who is more curious? I think he's as curious. So they were mutually curious. Friendship and French. I think being in the war in Europe enhanced the self-consciousness of Indian troops during the First World War. And this, according to me, is a good example of that. This is the front of the postcard. This is the backside of the postcard. This is an Indian Muslim writing guy called Amir, and he's writing in French to the family with whom he was probably billeted. And what you can reckon from the French postcard is, first of all, he's writing in French. Well, I do not think there were that many British soldiers who were fluent in French. So having a higher ability to learn other languages might put them on a higher level than the British comrades who were officially on a higher level. Clear from this postcard that he had a close relationship and befriended a white family, out of the question way back in India. That he knew how to speak and write French. And I want to remind you that writing was a requisite to join the Indian army, while it was not a requisite in the British army. So you actually had more illiterate people in the British army than you had in the Indian army. And he signs as Soldat Amir, soldier Amir, and he writes about, he calls himself Monsieur, Mr. Amir, which is also a sign of self-awareness. It's not just his name, it's a Mr. or a soldier added to it. So enhanced self-awareness. Very particular, very difficult experience is the experience in a prisoner of war camp. The Indians and Sikhs in prisoner of war camps in Germany, they were often isolated. They were sometimes in a situation where no one spoke the language until they would arrive in the camp, a particular camp called Halfling camp near Berlin, but until they were there, they were sometimes seen as an exotic attraction. We have one very poignant witness account of a soldier. He's taken prisoner of war, and while he's in the hospital recovering, he's in a separate room. Nobody speaks his language, and the Germans have put a panel on the door. This is the Indian prisoner, and the whole night and every day Germans come in just to look at him, to touch his turban, just treating him as a curiosity. They were quite much more dehumanized than other soldiers, but still they gave proof of agency. For instance, in sound recordings, this is something really, really extraordinary. The Germans were very curious. They had a lot of big scientists, and they were continuing their science in anthropology and musicology and in other sciences during the First World War, and so they made 1,500 sound recordings in prisoner of war camps during the First World War. And this morning, when I was shown the little Guru Granth Sahib that was given standard issue to Sikh soldiers during the First World War, this reminded me of one particular story that was recorded on one of the recordings. This is a Sikh, he's being interviewed, so he's talking in Gurmukhi, and what he says is, well, I will question you about loyalty. He says that there are all Germans surrounding him. I will question you about loyalty. We have asked the German Kaiser for a Romala, for a Guru Granth Sahib, and we haven't got it. And we asked the British, and they send it through the Red Cross. So to who do we owe more loyalty? So, and I mean, how brave you should be to say this when you are surrounded by Germans. Another example is the extraordinary irony of Chote Singh. Chote Singh was recorded, do I have the date? Somewhere in 1916, and I do not know if this will work. I will try to let you hear his voice in 1916. Shall it not work, Peter? Let's give it a try. I'll give it a try. Yeah. Do the sound recording here. Okay, you cannot, so you have to believe me. Now, what he does, Chote Singh, and this is a letter that was written to him. Chote Singh tells a story, an ordinary story, because they ask him to tell us a story. And towards the end of the recording, he starts to laugh, very loud in the recording. And then he says, in Punjabi, the following sentences. He's in a prisoner of war camp, so they have very little food. It's a very difficult time. They are very isolated. And what does he say in the recording? He says, "Oh, I would like to thank the German emperor for the wonderful food and accommodation he is offering us." Ha 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 ha. So it's a wonderful example of irony. I mean, this is really how strong-willed do you have to be to do this. So it's something I also, when I give this lecture on other places, like I did Monday in Kansas City in the National World War I Museum and Memorial, it's just a wonderful fragment. So the Sikhs in particular became objects of study. And there is one PhD student in Germany who went through all the prisoner of war camps where there were Sikhs, and he measured them. So this is part of racism studies, racial studies. So he believed that there were certain racial characteristics of the Sikhs, physical characteristics, and he would measure the skull, he would measure the length of feet, and so on, because he wanted to make physical characteristics of the Sikh ethnic group. So really scientific research. But otherwise there were scientists concerning linguistics, musicology, anthropology, but also propaganda photos taken in the prisoner of war camp. And this, for instance, is a very vile piece of German propaganda. These were Indian prisoners of war, clearly not Sikh, taken prison immediately after they were taken prisoner. And the German caption is very ironic and mean, because it says, well, these are, in German it's Englands Kulturträger, these are the bearers of civilization for Britain. So, which clearly shows how it's meant ironically how the Germans looked upon the Indians as lower people. Very important is that, so what did the Indian soldiers learn in Europe? And their letters home give us a clue. Now, mind you, the letters, there are many letters that have been preserved, but it's a very difficult source, because what we have is not the letters themselves, we have translations of extracts chosen by the British censor of a letter that was often dictated to be read out at the community at home. So it means that you have to read what we call against the grain to understand what they actually mean. But they have still a lot of information. And what we learn from these letters is that there is a lot of criticism of Europe, but that they are also mirroring this with the situation in India. So, learning from what is happening in Europe for the betterment of home. They are realizing the importance of education, including female education. Even if the soldiers, for instance, there is there Firoz Khan. I have seen in this country that no person is uneducated. All the inmates of a house are educated, and when they see one of our men going about with a letter in his hand to have it read, because he cannot read, they are very surprised. No doubt they think that we are very stupid since we can't read. Truly they are right, but as a man without education, nothing. Or women work in just the same way as men. For instance, one may be a station master, another schoolmaster. The difference is simply this: God made them women. This is what the Sikh wrote 29th of May 1916. Well, even if this Sikh did not realize that even to European standards this was an exceptional period, because not in the war, it was out of the question that a woman would be a station master or a printer or a policeman in Europe then, but still he's realizing certain things, that education is important, and it's something that you will see when they return to India, to the Punjab. Some of these veterans, they will found schools. They will begin schools for girls and boys. So the importance of education is something you see again and again. And then there's also, if you look at the last quote, a certain Tara Singh, 17th of July, 16, on that day, we all ate at the same table. Our company was composed of 5 sepoys, of whom 3 were Sikhs and 2 Muslims, 2 sweepers and 3 cooks, but we all ate together at the same table. Moreover, we have often eaten food and drunken tea prepared by Muslims. So this is actually the realization of a common Indianness across borders of religion, caste and ethnicity. While in India these people would not be able to meet, they did so in Europe, and that would be very important to create some kind of national, proto-nationalism, which would play an enormous role in then the route to Indian independence. And this was also realized by the Britishers. For instance, this quote by a Protestant missionary and officer in the Indian Labour Corps. He said, well, the men, the Indians, have learned new conceptions of the unity of India, that they are men who will be listened to as authoritative witnesses because of the new things they have seen in foreign lands, that they realize their own importance and the magnitude of what India has done for Britain, and that they, in their several communities, will be men with progressive ideas, both in the realm of social matters, religious customs and politics. Combatants and non-combatants alike, they are men to be reckoned with, men who have received a concentrated education in a short space of time. And what you see, in fact, is that many veterans, when they return to Punjab, they become leaders within the community, they become activists for improvement, and they undertake political action. And this, to me, is an important, and maybe the most important element of the Indian presence on the Western Front, that these soldiers had an importance that went much further than their military exploits, that as individuals, as agents, they did help to change India, to change Punjab into becoming the state it is today. Now I come to the last part of my talk, and it is how do we commemorate the Sikh presence in Europe, more particularly in Flanders. So in Europe there were attempts to set the memory of the Indian presence on the Western Front in stone, and one example is on 24th of July 1927, the Menin Gate, which you see on this photograph, was unveiled in Ieper, and it's arguably the most important memorial to the missing on the Western Front. What is a memorial to the missing? Well, you have the soldiers who have a grave with a name on, but then in the First World War, due to the nature of the war, where more than half of the soldiers were literally blown to bits, so an artillery shell, and then nothing remains, or very little remains, so most of the soldiers went missing, and their names are inscribed on this memorial in Ypres. And besides the name, thousands of names of British, Irish, Australians, Canadians, on this memorial, for instance, you have 400 names of Indians reported missing around Ypres. So around my hometown, not in France, but only around Ypres. This is also, it's quite an important place, because this is also the only place in the world where every day there is a remembrance ceremony for the casualties of the First World War. So every day at 8 o'clock, traffic is stopped. You've got 2 or more buglers, and they stand in the middle of the gate and they play Last Post, which is the British equivalent of taps here in the US, and that's it. It's very brief, it's very simple, but it's every night. Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve, bright weather, terrible weather, it goes on, 8 p.m. sharp, and it involves the public. Still, there are many mistakes on the Menin Gate, and here I get back to the 47 Sikhs. Some of the Indians, some of the Sikhs who fell in Ypres are mentioned on the Neuve-Chapelle Memorial, which I will show you today. But the numbers of Sikhs, especially, commemorated on these memorials of the missing are vastly underestimated. And I'll give you one example. I've already mentioned the 47 Sikhs. I'll just remind you, 26th of April 1915, and they go into battle with 444, 347 do not come back. This is the panel, while it was being made, on the Menin Gate, how many names we see of the 47 Sikhs? 14. 14. Where are the 330 others? Vanished. not commemorated. So, clear example that many are not properly commemorated. This is 25 miles south of where I live. This is the Neuf-Chapelle Memorial that has officially the names of all those of the Indian Army who were killed in France and Flanders, still vastly underestimated, yet on the same time a very nice, very moving memorial, often visited by the Sikh community of northern France. Sikh community who's especially involved in the commemoration of the First World War. I'll give you some examples. That's what you see to the right. Well, actually, these 4 photographs all have to do with the thing that I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, the Ieper Vaisakhi, 1st to 3rd of April 1999, where part of it was, this is now part of the museum, so that was a temporary Gurdwara where, pardon me, but I forgot the exact name, but there was a full lecture of the Guru Granth Sahib during 3 days. And at the end of that, you've got these Panch Pyaras going to the Menin Gate, where there was a very big ceremonial, and also part of the commemoration was the unveiling, which you see here. This is the flag of the city of Ieper. In the pouring rain, the unveiling of the first memorial since these two, first memorial commemorating the presence of Indian troops on the Western Front. And it's particularly a Sikh memorial because it was created, and that's the text that reads it. So the Indian presence was disappeared completely from collective memory, and it's due thanks to the Sikh community in Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, that it was revived. And it's Sikhs and diaspora who have, together with the local people, have unveiled this, had this realized. And it's set, it's quite simple, but it is set near the place where the first Indian casualty fell in 1914. And this is still maintained by the Sikh community. So every year, 11th of November, around 11th of November, they come, they clean it together with the local people from the town council. We make sure that it looks neat, and it's next to a farm, and the farmer is that used, he opens his courtyard, and it's on the courtyard of that farm that the langar is served. We also work together with our friends of the Chatri Memorial Committee in Brighton, because what happened was that the Indian soldiers who were wounded in Flanders, they were brought to a hospital in Brighton, about 3 hospitals basically in Brighton, so on the English south coast. And those who died in that hospital, they were cremated just out on the downs, in the open fields. And after the war, a Chatri was created there. And the last 15 years, so for more than 80 years, nothing happened there. The Chatri was there, nobody knew what it was about. And it's the last 15 years that we have created an annual commemoration where many Sikhs living in Britain are gathering, and where afterwards there's also tea and a get-together. But as you can see, it's a well-attended yearly ceremony. And then I have to tell you something remarkable. You see that we created this monument with the Sikh community in 1999. And what happened was, this is really a bottom-up approach, grassroots project. And then we had the reaction of the Indian embassy in Belgium and the Indian representative in the War Graves Commission saying, oh, but this is purely grassroots, but we also need an official monument commemorating the Indian presence. And so 3 years later, next to the Menin Gate, you had this created. So, but the thing is, and the former, I'll tell you something, the former ambassador of India to Belgium was a Sikh, and I had a very good relationship with him. And I asked him, but yeah, Mr. Ambassador, there's one problem with this memorial, because it's a memorial that is, it's the symbol of the Republic of India, which came about in 1947. But about I guess 1/3 of the soldiers who died here would today be coming from Pakistan. So how should I, as a historian, how should I interpret this memorial? Is it the Republic of India taking care of all those who died as Indian soldiers? Or is it the Republic of India claiming all the Indian war dead of the First World War? Obviously he said, well, it's the first thing, but I'm not that sure. So you see, there's always something political, but what is very important is that each 12th of November, so the day after Armistice Day, which is a public holiday in Belgium and France, every year on the 12th of November, it is also the location of a remembrance ceremony in cooperation with the Indian Embassy in Brussels. But on the 11th of November, when the main ceremony is taking place in Ypres, on the Dominion Gate, this is what you always get, is a quite important delegation of the local Sikh communities taking part, and this is always broadcasted live on Belgian TV, with reports on British TV, French TV, and so on. So it's an important moment of exposure of the local Sikh community. Now I want to end with the following conclusion. The First World War was an important step in the becoming of the Sikh awareness, and more broadly in India's struggle for freedom, or whatever your opinion about India. The Indian military, who was present in Europe, realized that they were differently treated by other white men. They wanted to learn from the West in the field of education, but also being critical of spiritual matters in Europe. What they basically saw is that these white folks, who always thought that their civilization was the highest level, well, they were killing each other in a massive scale. So they also learned about national awareness. So you had men from different castes, different religions, different backgrounds fighting together, which created a kind of unity. And they realized that loyalty towards the British overlord would not be properly rewarded with self-governance of any kind, because when they returned to India, to the Punjab, 1919, you all know what happened. April 1919, you've got the massacre of Amritsar, and the latest scholarship believes that there were at least 2 veterans of the First World War amongst the casualties in Jallianwala Bagh. So it shows them what their loyalty towards the British had been worth, and it was, as you know, a major watershed. And again, I would like to finish with this conclusion. This is one of the few episodes in history where your history and our history touch. It is something we share, it is common ground, and by consequence, it's an opportunity to meet, as I've done today. Thank you very much.